September 1884. On the Republican River uplands of southern Nebraska, the grass had already gone the color of old straw, and the wind had the dry edge of a knife. Every settler on that rise was doing the same thing, hauling lumber, stacking sod, raising walls before winter. Every settler except Jonas Bjarnason. He was cutting a doorway straight into the side of the earth. By the second week, the chamber was so deep that when Jonas worked inside, the prairie seemed to be swallowing him a little more every day. The neighbors laughed. They said the Icelander had come all the way to Nebraska just to live like a badger. Then the county inspector rode out, looked at the hole in the bluff, and threatened to mark the claim as unimproved. Because, to everyone watching, Jonas was not building a house, he was disappearing into the ground. And 3 months later, in one of the hardest storms of that winter, the warmest home for miles would be the one they mocked. This is the story of a house that looked like failure from the outside and felt like salvation from within. A story about old country memory, thermal mass, and the quiet frontier genius of building where the wind had less power. Jonas Bjarnason had not grown up in a place where men admired exposed walls. He was born in northern Iceland, where winter did not simply arrive, it occupied. The farmhouses of his childhood were built in partnership with the ground, timber skeletons wrapped in turf, banked against the wind, roofed in living sod, warmed by careful fire and thick earth. You did not leave your house naked to the weather if you had any sense. You thickened it. You sheltered it, you reduced every unnecessary exchange between warm life inside and killing air outside. Before emigrating, Jonas had spent years cutting turf blocks, packing walls, and repairing roof edges after North Atlantic storms. He knew how damp soil behaved when drained properly. He knew how sod sealed itself when layered thick. And he knew the real test of a house was not how proud it looked from the road. It was whether your children slept warm while the wind tried to peel the world apart. America had promised him land. It had not promised him wisdom. His first winter in Nebraska taught him that brutally. Like everyone else, Jonas rushed up a conventional shack, low walls of sod, scrap boards on top, one door that never fully shut, one small window that frosted over before evening. From a distance, it looked respectable. Inside, it was misery. The wind was the real enemy. It found every seam, it pressed through the door frame, it slid between the roofing layers. And when the stove slackened, it reached down the pipe like a thief returning for what it had missed. The little cast-iron stove glowed furiously 2 feet away, and 6 feet from it, the room was still hostile. Heat climbed. Cold pooled.
Slept near the floor, in the worst air in the house. By January, Jonas had burned nearly everything he could spare: cottonwood roots, twisted grass, dry dung, broken crate wood. He fed that stove like it was an animal with a grudge, and the shack still never truly warmed. Katrin kept broth simmering, less for supper than for moisture, because the air inside cracked their lips and turned every cough into a warning. The walls bled dust. The corners collected drifts of wind-blown snow, so fine it looked sifted through cloth. One night, after a blue norther dropped the temperature without warning, Jonas woke and saw ice feathering the inside wall above his son's blanket. He lay there listening to the stove tick and the children breathe, and he understood something with absolute clarity. He was not failing because the winter was too strong. He was failing because the house was designed to lose. That thought stayed with him all spring. Other settlers talked about weather as if it were a test of grit. You endured. You stacked more wood. You stuffed more rags into the cracks. You prayed the roof held. Jonas said very little. He was not interested in heroic language. He was interested in not watching his children cough through another winter in a glorified sieve. The bluff on the south edge of his claim gave him the answer. It was not dramatic land. Just a long rise with a prairie broke toward a shallow draw. But the southern face caught the low winter sun. The earth there was firm enough to hold a cut. And after every rain, Jonas watched how the water moved. He paced the bluff for days. He dug test holes. He checked where the soil turned denser and cooler. Then he began. Instead of building a box above ground and begging it to keep heat, He would carve the main room into the protected side of the bluff, below the level of the worst wind. He would give the house only one exposed face, toward the south, where winter light could enter. 3 sides, and most of the roof, would belong to the earth itself. The labor was brutal. The logic was simple. Air on the open prairie could swing violently in a single day. Packed ground below the frost zone did not. Earth changed slowly. Earth resisted extremes. Earth stored and moderated. A thin board wall with cracks invited heat loss. A thick mass of soil around a chamber buffered it. If Jonas kept runoff away, kept the roof tight, and stopped direct drafts through the entrance, he would not be trying to heat a box suspended in violent air. He would be nudging a sheltered room upward from the Earth's own steadier baseline. So he excavated. He carved the chamber back into the bluff and sloped the floor toward a drainage trench filled with stone. He set stout cottonwood posts where they mattered most, then laid heavy roof poles across the span. Over those went willow brush, then prairie grass, then thick sod, roots facing upward, so the mat would knit itself together and shed the weather. Along the roof and sidewalls, he banked more earth until the dwelling nearly disappeared into the rise. From the open plain, the house was almost invisible except for a doorway, 2 small south-facing windows, and a stovepipe. The entrance was the clever part. Jonas cut it as a short, angled passage, not a simple opening. At the outer end, a heavy plank door. At the inner end, another. Between them, a narrow pocket of trapped air. On the coldest night, the wind would have to break twice before it touched the living space. Katrin worked beside him, wherever she could. She lined shelves into the wall niches. She stitched cloth for draft curtains. She tamped the floor. The children carried kindling and armfuls of dry grass. What looked to the neighbors like desperation was, to the family building it, a machine for survival. The laughter on the ridge did not stop. If anything, it sharpened. Amos Pike called it Bjarnason's burrow. Another man said it looked like a fox den with ambitions. Women in passing wagons whispered that no decent family should sleep underground. And because frontier people often mistake unfamiliar engineering for weakness, the criticism turned moral. A man who chose protection over display looked to them less brave, less American, less willing to face the weather like a man. But the truth was simpler than their pride. Most of those little cabins were already losing. Their roofs were thin. Their joints were sloppy. Their walls were drying into gaps. And once the prairie wind accelerated against them, every flaw would become a current. The stove would heat the ceiling, not the bedrolls. Frost would grow on the inside walls. Families would crowd close to fire, while the room itself remained unconquered. Wentworth returned in late October, expecting to find repentance. Instead, he found the house nearly finished. The doorway was framed. The sod roof had greened faintly after an early rain. Smoke drifted steadily from the stovepipe. Katrin was hanging a kettle hook by the stove, while the children carried in folded blankets. From the front, the place no longer looked like a burrow. It looked like a piece of the bluff that had decided to become useful. Wentworth was unimpressed. "You went through with it," he said. Jonas nodded. "This cannot be considered standard housing." "No," Jonas said. "It can be considered warm." Wentworth's mouth tightened. Warm is not a legal category. He stepped to the doorway, peered inside, and recoiled not from danger, but from insult. The room was tidy, dry, smelled of cut earth and wood smoke. Yet because it was low, banked, and mostly hidden, he judged it primitive before he judged whether it worked. "I will file my report," he said. "If your family insists on wintering in this excavation, that is your decision. But if the territory asks whether this proves settlement and advancement, my answer will be plain." Katrin finally answered him. "Come back in January," she said. "Bring your plain answer then." Wentworth flushed, muttered about obstinate foreigners, and left. Winter did not wait until January to test the matter. The first serious blizzard hit in early December. By afternoon the light had collapsed into a gray-white wall. Snow came sideways. The winds did not merely blow, it struck.
Inside the bluff house, Jonas fed the stove with split cottonwood and watched the room answer differently than the old shack ever had. The heat did not flee upward and vanish, it settled. The packed earth walls stayed cool near the entrance, but never hostile. The room held its temperature as though the whole hillside were quietly participating in the work. And the little air pocket between the two doors stopped every blast at the threshold. When the outer door opened, cold entered the entry passage and died there. Katrin kneaded rye dough at the table, Runa sat on the floor without huddling. Leaf peeled potatoes with solemn concentration. The air smelled of bread, wool, and a trace of smoke. Not luxury, something better. Margin. A half-mile away, Amos Pike was discovering what pride could not insulate. By nightfall, dry snow was pushing through the cracks of his cabin so steadily that the interior corners turned white. His wife nailed blankets over the door. Amos stuffed sod and rags into gaps that seemed to open new mouths as fast as he closed them. The stove roared. The room remained cold. This was the arithmetic of exposed housing on the plains. Every hour of severe weather was a bill: fuel, breath, sleep, strength, attention. You paid, and still the heat leaked away through every thin surface. The storm deepened after midnight. Jonas woke twice to check the roof poles, and once to brush snow creeping against the outer door. Each time he stepped into the entry passage and heard the blizzard as a muffled violence beyond the earth, not as an invader already inside the room. Returning through the inner door felt like crossing a border the storm was not allowed to cross. At dawn, a crock of water on the rear shelf was still liquid. The children's blankets were just blankets, not crusted white from frozen breath. These were small details. On that prairie, they amounted to proof. Then came the January storm, the one people remembered. It began with a stillness so complete that experienced settlers felt fear before the wind even rose. Then the temperature dropped as if the bottom had fallen out of the air. By evening, the gale hit. Snow, old powder, and hard new ice lifted together. Men lost sight of their own barns. Livestock vanished behind white sheets. A person could walk in a circle 10 yards from safety and never know it.
Wentworth was returning from a circuit of claims when the whiteout took him. He aimed for a line of bluffs he thought he recognized, but the storm erased depth and direction alike. His horse stumbled, panicked, fought the reins. Wentworth hauled it toward what he hoped was shelter, and only later understood that the animal had chosen more wisely than he had. The horse was taking him to Jonas's claim. At first, Wentworth saw almost nothing, just a low swell of earth nearly buried in drift. Then the stovepipe, smoke whipping flat in the wind. Then something stranger still. His horse lowered its head beside the entry mound and refused to move on. Wentworth dragged himself closer, beard iced solid, fingers numb inside his gloves, expecting no help. And then he felt it. Not much. Just a thread of warmth touching the frozen skin of his face whenever the wind shifted. In a world of iron cold, that tiny breath of warm air felt impossible. It was not the furious blast of a stove flue. It was the steady exhale of a room that had heat to spare. He struck the outer door once with his fist. It opened almost immediately. Jonas stood there in shirt sleeves. That sight nearly undid him. No heavy coat, no blanket around the shoulders, no desperate look. Just a man from the hill house answering the door as though it were an ordinary afternoon. "You are freezing," Jonas said. Wentworth tried to answer and only coughed. Jonas pulled him into the entry, shut the outer door, opened the inner one, and led him inside. The transition was staggering. Outside had been noise, assault, pain. Inside was lamplight, steady warmth, and still air. Wentworth's ears rang from the silence. His face burned as sensation returned. The children looked up from the table where they had been sorting dried beans. Katrin was folding breadcloth beside the stove. Nothing in the room suggested panic except the distant pressure of the storm over the roof. Wentworth turned slowly, taking in detail after detail his own theory of housing had told him should not exist. The walls were dry, the floor was firm. There was no draft at his ankles, no stream of cold leaking from a window, no furnace hunger in the stove. The room felt inhabited, not defended. Then he saw the lamp. A simple kerosene lamp standing on the center table, its glass chimney warm, its flame rising in one clean yellow shape. In every winter cabin Wentworth had known, a flame was nervous. It quivered under door leaks, bent away from unseen currents, told the truth about bad construction no matter what the builder claimed. But this flame did not move. It stood perfectly vertical, steady as if it had been lit under glass. And in that stillness, Wentworth understood more than any argument could have taught him. This house had not merely kept warm, it had defeated the wind. He looked at Jonas with the humility of a man hearing reality after months of listening only to custom. "This was no burrow," he said softly. Jonas waited. Wentworth looked around the room again, then gave the only honest verdict left to him. "This is a shelter built by someone who actually understood the country." He stayed until the storm eased enough for travel. During those hours, he asked questions like a student. How deep was the chamber? How thick was the roof sod? Why angle the entrance? How did the drainage run? How much fuel had they burned compared with last winter? Jonas answered plainly, without triumph. Katrin added notes about condensation, storage, and where the warmest sleeping places were set. Wentworth wrote everything down, and when the roads opened, his report changed completely. He described the Bjarnason dwelling as a banked earthen residence of unusual efficiency, admirably adapted to the realities of the district. He noted its dryness, its low fuel use, its resistance to wind infiltration. He recommended that exposed claims not be judged only by above-ground appearance, when earth integration could produce better shelter. That report did not transform the plains overnight. It did something more believable. It embarrassed practical men into curiosity. Amos Pike came first. He had suffered enough to listen. In March, he stood at Jonas's doorway with a notebook and a sheepish expression and asked one simple question. "How long did you make that entry passage?" Another family copied the south-facing front and the double-door arrangement, though they kept half the room above grade. A ranch hand at a nearby line camp reused the drainage trench idea and found his quarters much drier. By autumn, a military engineer passing through Fort McPherson had heard enough about the Bluff House to ride over and sketch it himself. No frontier revolution announces itself properly. It spreads by imitation, by fuel saved, by children not coughing, by neighbors noticing who slept through the storm and who spent the night feeding a stove like a sacrificial altar. The irony was beautiful. The very thing that made Wentworth suspicious, that the house looked less like a declaration and more like an accommodation, was its genius. It did not perform settlement for distant eyes. It performed shelter for actual bodies. Modern building science would later give names to the principles Jonas was using without jargon: berth sheltering, thermal mass, reduced air infiltration, passive solar gain, vestibule buffering. But Jonas did not need the vocabulary. He knew a house should not challenge the climate like a duelist if it could instead enter into partnership with it. He knew every crack mattered. He knew wind was often more dangerous than temperature. And he knew the ground under his feet was not an enemy but a vast slow reservoir of stability. That may be the deepest lesson here. The frontier myth loves the image of a person standing upright against the storm, chest out, daring nature to do its worst. It is a dramatic image. It is also, very often, a cold one. Jonas Bjarnason chose a less theatrical courage. He let go of appearances. He ignored ridicule. He trusted observation over custom. And when the plains demanded a house that could survive reality, rather than symbolize defiance, he built one. He did not conquer the Nebraska winter. He built where the winter had less power, and in doing so, he turned a bluff in an empty grassland into the safest room for miles. If this story gave you something worth thinking about, subscribe for more forgotten engineering, frontier survival, and historical ingenuity that changed lives long before it made headlines. And tell me in the comments, what is the smartest solution you have ever seen that looked completely wrong at first glance? This episode is a historically inspired reconstruction for storytelling and education. The named characters and specific incidents in this version are fictionalized, but the building logic is grounded in real frontier dugouts, bankhouses, turf construction, and earth-sheltered survival methods used across harsh climates.